Welcome to Close Encounters of the Holy Kind, a Lent lectionary podcast. I am Pastor Sarah. I'm the pastor at Tibbetts UMC in West Seattle, and I am joined today by my friends.
Hello, I'm Charles.
And I'm Tim.
Yes, and Tim is our special guest. Pastor Tim is our special guest, joining us from Illinois. And we're sad that Rachael is under the weather and is not here to join us for our recording today. But Tim, we're really glad to have you. Also, you're my dad, so I'm going to refer to you as dad throughout this. We're glad that you're here.
Not very professional.
Oh, that's okay. We're informal here. We're just be yourself. Be yourself. This episode has been recorded for the 5th Sunday of Lent, which is Sunday, March 26th. And our gospel reading today is John 11, verses 1 through 45. I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Charles, what translation are you reading from today?
My trusty Message.
The Message. And Dad, what translation are you reading from?
The Common English Bible.
CEB. Represent. Rachael would be proud. That's her fave translation. We have another long text this week, so we're going to split it up into 3 parts and read it together so you can listen, follow along with your favorite translation if you'd like, but we're going to jump in. So I'm going to start us off, John chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is sick." But when Jesus heard this, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you are going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go now to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us go, that we may die with him."
When Jesus finally got there, he found Lazarus already 4 days dead. Bethany was near Jerusalem, only a couple of miles away, and many of the Jews were visiting Martha and Mary, sympathizing with them over their brother. Martha heard Jesus was coming and went out to meet him. Mary remained in the house. Martha said, "Master, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask God, he will give you." Jesus said, "Your brother will be raised up." Martha replied, "I know that he will be raised up in the resurrection at the end of time." You don't have to wait for the end. I am right now, resurrection and life. The one who believes in me, even though he or she dies, will live. And everyone who lives believing in me does not ultimately die at all. Do you believe this? Yes, Master. All along I have believed that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who comes into the world. After saying this, she went to her sister Mary and whispered in her ear, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." The moment she heard that, she jumped up and ran out to him. Jesus had not yet entered the town, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When her sympathizing Jewish friends saw Mary run off, they followed her, thinking she was on her way to the tomb to weep there. Mary came to where Jesus was waiting and fell at his feet, saying, "Master, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her sobbing, and the Jews with her sobbing, a deep anger welled up within him. He said, "Where did you put him?" "Master, come and see," they said. Now Jesus wept. The Jews said, "Look how deeply he loved him." Others among them said, "Well, if he loved him so much, why didn't he do something to keep him from dying? After all, he opened the eyes of a blind man."
Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone covered the entrance. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "Lord, the smell will be awful. He's been dead 4 days." Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory?" So they removed the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me. I say for the benefit of the crowd standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied, and his face covered with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who came with Mary and saw what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Cha cha cha.
The word of God for the people of God. Cha cha cha.
Cha cha cha. Yeah.
Cha cha cha. I love that. Oh my gosh, another meaty one. We're still in John's gospel. We had a little nod reference to the scripture reading from last Sunday of the man born blind from John 9 that we discussed last week. So yeah, what came up for you in this reading? Anything that immediately stood out to you, or something that you want to jump into right away?
A couple things are like popping up for me. First of all, like the point of Lazarus being this person that Jesus loves so deeply, and then, I mean, calling out, which we all do, I think, that he stayed on 2 more days, and what was that about? And I was picking things out, but that's like kind of, I guess, towards the beginning of the text. And I don't know, I haven't read all of John, but I was like, we haven't read any in our for this podcast about Lazarus until now. Like, I don't know if he's shown up in the story before, but it's, so important that the story's in here. But again, we haven't talked about Lazarus yet in our
well, and this one's unique to John's gospel, right? We don't see this in the other gospels. Is that right, Dad?
That's right.
Yeah. And we know, I mean, Jesus was like these were his friends. Like he was closer with Mary and Martha and Lazarus than the disciples, like these are his people. It's interesting though that like he stays 2 more days. It's like he really wants to make sure he's dead,
Yeah, that he's very dead. And
Yeah.
when he said it at that point, he was already dead.
Yes.
So he'd been dead a couple days then. So
yeah, he's like, seems Jesus is dragging his feet a little bit here.
He's pausing for a dramatic effect, like he has been doing in so many of these other stories.
The pregnant pause.
Yeah.
We also get that line similar to John 9. This illness does not lead to death, rather it's for God's glory, so that the Son of Man may be glorified. And we heard that similar for the scripture reading for last week, John 9, the man born blind. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. So again, Jesus repeating himself. This is for some greater purpose.
Which isn't to say that the man was made blind by God so that later on God could do something special.
Same
I
to be
would-
said with Lazarus too. Like God
Yeah.
didn't cause him to die, so that.
No, exactly. But an opportunity has arisen for God to be glorified. I don't know about either of you, but I have difficulty with the story itself, from beginning to end, pretty much. I mean, I know that it is here, um, in large part for theological purposes,
Mhm.
as much as anything else. And but if this story were historical, I can't believe it wouldn't be in the synoptics. I mean,
Yeah.
come on. He
Yeah.
raised somebody from the dead who'd been dead 4 days.
Mhm.
But I know that the reasons behind it are greater than just whether or not it's historical.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's like other stories that I know of. I can appreciate the theological purpose behind it. I can believe in the story, but not necessarily in its historicity.
Mhm. That it actually happened.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with the virgin birth the same way.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, this seems to be like the event that is like the final nail in the coffin for Jesus, right? I
it
mean,
is.
he's healed people, he's conversed with a, Samaritan woman, he's healed the blind man, he's healed some other people, he's been performing miracles, he's fed the 5,000, and now all of a sudden it's like the last thing is he raises somebody from the dead. And the scripture does say too that Jesus says, like, let's go back to Judea. And the disciples are like, that is a dangerous place for you. Why would we go back there?
Exactly, it is.
Yeah.
They're in Judea now, and it's yeah, it's a hard place to be right now.
And
Since,
Bethany's like right outside Jerusalem, right?
yes,
That would have been like on the way to
like
Jerusalem.
a suburb.
The suburb, Bethany, the suburb of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
What do you make of this? Let's just kind of move through here since Charles, you started at the beginning. This whole exchange, like verses 7-16, when the disciples are like, oh, he's sleeping. And Jesus is like, no, he's dead. Well, first Jesus says he's sleeping and they misinterpret him and think he's just taking a nap. And then Jesus says, no, he's dead. Like, I almost feel like we could just do without those verses. So Dad, when you were like the theological significance, I'm wondering
Well,
what's there.
is that he's dead. And that I think it's interesting that Jesus refers to it as sleeping.
Mhm.
Sleeping is temporary,
Mhm.
as opposed to dead, which is permanent. At least that's the way we think of dead versus sleeping. And there may be purpose behind that. But I also think that the greater purpose is woven into the I am statements, because we are going to have those now. The I am the bread alive, I am the
Well, those are coming though. That hasn't happened yet, has it?
right. No, it hasn't. But this is the end of what would be referred to as the book of signs. Have you read anything about that? In the Gospel of John, people have tried to divvy up John
Mm-hmm.
in any number of ways, including trying to come up with a formula so that you have these 7 signs and these 7 sayings, and then something.
That is so like us. Like, oh,
But
we
it
must
doesn't
categorize this.
it doesn't work. First
Right.
of all, there are more I am statements than just the 7 they might want to count.
Mm-hmm.
And there are more signs than just the 7 they want to count.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because like Jesus walking on the water, they debate whether that's really a sign or not.
Oh, I
Sign-
forgot that he walks on the water too. That's right. Wow.
Well,
What a badass. He's doing a lot of crazy stuff.
Showboat.
Showboat. What a
Yeah.
showboat. What
Yeah,
a queen.
just
What a queen.
always putting things. He
Mm.
Yeah, staying with the Gospel of John, what it does is that it's continuing the theme of Jesus's deity, that he has the authority of God.
Mhm.
And in last week's reading in the CEB, it makes reference to Jesus as the human one,
Mhm.
as the Son of Man, or the human one. And that is not a phrase that is to be ignored in the context of John, especially since it's working so hard to talk about Jesus's deity. When he gets down to, I am the resurrection and I am the life,
Mhm.
those definite articles are meant to be there before resurrection and life. And there is, so far as anyone else knows of, no one else who raises people from the dead except for God.
So let's unpack for a second Jesus' divinity, because I'm really into human Jesus. Like I have low Christology, which just means
Most
I'm
liberals do.
most liberals do. I mean,
Yes.
I feel like I can hold in tension that balance between Jesus' divinity and humanity, but I find his humanity a little bit more relatable. I don't know, Charles, do you have a strong feeling one way or the other about Jesus' divinity versus humanity?
Y'all. No, I'm soaking it all up, and I'm like, this is a lot to think about. But I don't like when I'm trying to think of like, what do I think when I think of Jesus? Like, what am I, I think of this little like picture I had of Jesus from when I was a kid, of like him like knocking on a door.
Right.
And I was always like, Jesus is so pretty. Like that's in you guys are like up here with your like talking
Yes.
about Jesus's divinity or humanity. And I'm like, Jesus just had really nice hair and
Yes,
like,
yes, yes, yes,
Like it was a photograph in front of Macy's or something.
yes,
yeah, he's
yeah.
very clean. I was like, wow, like looks like he smells good. And now like as I'm like thinking about all this, I'm like, no, nobody back then smelled good. No, like all these
Right,
things.
right,
Yeah,
right.
that's what I'm thinking.
Would not have been clean shaven.
Well, it's
Yeah.
a little bit like the guy who was born blind. I looked around the room and I said, look around, see the number of people wearing glasses. And those of you not wearing glasses, I bet a bunch of you are wearing contact lenses. Now, what that says to me is that in Jesus's day, people bumped into each other a lot
Yes, yes,
and
yeah.
do other things.
Yeah.
Context is everything.
Yes.
I don't know, Charles, are you familiar with Exodus, where Moses is addressed by the burning bush? And you've probably seen the movie by Charlton Heston anyway.
Yes, I have.
Well,
Yeah.
in that particular instance, Moses wants to know the name of the God who is sending him back to Egypt. And like I'm going to call God by a first name if I know it. But anyways, Moses wants to know his name, and his response is, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. Both are valid translations, but I am who I am. So that when you get to the Gospel of John, the I am things become particularly important, because that's how God identified the God self when Moses pressed him on it, pressed God on it, or the burning bush. Now, in the Eastern Church, there are some who would say that on that day when the bush burned, the voice that was being that was God's voice, certainly, but it was actually Jesus who was speaking.
Oh.
And
Okay.
they interpret a lot of Old Testament things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my Old Testament professor promised to set me on fire if I did that. Apparently,
like Bush going up
Yeah.
in flames.
yeah, but apparently the first century disciples were allowed.
So I really love this thread. I mean, tugging on, the historical memory of Exodus and Moses and the Hebrew people, which I never realized that before. So thank you, Dad. You taught me something new today.
I'm always happy to please.
Do you think John's the author of John's gospel, I mean, that was intentional, these I am statements? Was that
absolutely.
intentional?
Oh, yes. And see,
Interesting.
I'm convinced that John knew of the synoptics.
Yeah,
And
because John was written 50, 60 years after they had been circulating for a while.
Yeah, at least 30 years.
Oh, and just a reminder to everyone, the synoptics refer to the other three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So
yes,
John is like special.
Were written around 70 AD.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Something like that.
And John was around 100, right?
That's right.
Look at how impressive we are with our Bible knowledge.
Yeah.
Our seminary professors.
We all deserve a degree or something.
Yeah, something. So, yeah. Well, okay. Jesus says it's not until later in the story when he's talking with Mary, right? When he says, I'm the resurrection and the life.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, no, it's Martha. He says it to Martha. Yeah, so, okay, keep moving through this text. So we have that whole exchange with the disciples where Jesus is like, he's dead. We're going back. Oh, and then Thomas says, let's go so we may die with him.
Like, that's, yeah, I kept thinking about that. It was like, Thomas is like all in, like,
yeah,
and why do we care that he's Didymus, the twin? I mean,
well, it's just a signifier, right?
As opposed to all the other Thomases in his group.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Well, and this is also the Thomas that later doubts, right?
Yes.
So it's interesting that here Thomas is like,
John a lot.
Let's go die with Jesus.
Well, he does it in chapter 14 too, when he says to Jesus, what is the way, and we'll come with you. Well, I am the way, or Thomas brings up some question. Philip is in there too. But anyways, Thomas is looked like a doubter throughout.
Yes.
It's not just the one at the end of the I started to say before is that I think one of the reasons why it became important for the writer of John to write what he wrote the way he wrote it was because of an awareness of the other gospels, and perhaps a conviction, although that seems like a bit much, that they didn't emphasize Jesus's deity enough.
Ooh, okay, I love this because I feel like when I hear people tell stories, especially about a particular event, often I think to myself, as a storyteller, oh, I could tell that better. And there's important things that you've left out of that, right? So I feel like that's what John is like, oh, okay, let me tell you the other thing that happened, especially since this is unique to John.
Well, if you took all of the events and put them in time, Jesus's life, these 3 years according to John and the 1 year according to the synoptics, and looked at every event that happened in Jesus's life, you might get a whole week worth of his life,
right?
Hours, or less, because we know so little about him that you can't look at a scripture lesson without thinking to yourself, if they wrote it down, it must have been important.
Right. Yeah.
And then sometimes I'm not at all certain that's true.
Yes. Well, continuing to follow in the text, like starting sort of verse 17-ish, Jesus finally gets there after dilly-dallying.
Right.
And I really like that the gospel author emphasizes more than once that it's been 4 days. So his body's in the tomb 4 days.
There's a theological reason too, is that it was a Jewish belief among some of that time that the spirit didn't leave the body until after 3 days. And so
Oh,
he is completely dead. He is deader than dead. Now I've heard that. I did not read that somewhere, so I have no source for you whatsoever, and it may be apocryphal. But
so
that's what I was told.
fact check before you use that in a sermon.
But it sounds like it's a possibility.
Yeah, 4 days. And so the scene at Bethany when Jesus arrives, oh, he's still 2 miles away. The Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them. Martha hears that Jesus is coming, and so she goes to meet him. And then we have this exchange.
Yeah.
I love, like, Martha. How many conversations have we had with God of like, if you had only been there.
Yeah, that's right.
If you had only been there, this wouldn't have happened. Yeah. Thoughts on this. Charles, do you have anything that comes up for you in this next section?
Just thinking about how the story of Mary and Martha was the one, like cleaning and doing the chores, and she's very type A, which I can relate to. And so like the fact that she's like, oh, Jesus is here, it's about time that bitch showed up. And so she like goes to hunt him down and is like, if you had been here, like this wouldn't have happened. Like, why? Like, what the hell is wrong with you? And
I'd have been mad. I'd have been just furious.
And
but then again,
hold on, Dad, let Charles finish. Let him finish.
Oh no, just that she is like, even now I know that whatever you ask, God will give you. So she's like, I know you have an in, like, so use your power, whatever, you have it in with God. And I like that she's thinking of this one way of like resurrection, like I have to wait till the end of time for like this to happen. And we go into the Jesus saying you don't have to wait. And but just like that very human knee-jerk reaction, like I know you can get what we want from God, so like now that you're here, do your work your mojo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things too we know about Jesus is that we know that he can heal from a distance. You have the centurion who comes to him one day, or whoever it is who comes to him and says, I've got a friend way over town who's sick. And so, Jesus was like, okay, let's go over. And the guy's like, no. You can do it from here. I mean, I command people all over the place and they do it without me having to be present. And so we know that Jesus can heal without actually being present. On the other hand, they're making a big deal out of Jesus being absent and present.
Yes.
And he's present when he's present, and then he's not before. But the question is, there something that we make or can make out of the presence of Jesus in this instance?
Ooh, that's good.
Or am I just making stuff up now?
Well, I think
a lot.
I think presence matters. This is something that's been coming up a lot lately in ministry now that we're like, we can live stream things.
Exactly. You're going to go into for communion, aren't you?
No, but we could talk about communion. But no, I just want to talk about like the being present, because this is great. So like, Charles moved across the country, and it's so wonderful that we get to like video chat, and it makes me feel so much closer to you as my friend, that I can connect with you and see your face. And like, I think we've been able to stay close partly because of that. But it's also not the same as like sipping sweet tea on your front porch,
Right.
as being able to karaoke together live and in person. And there is something about the physical presence, like being in the physical presence of one another, of another human being. I mean, even that's like, the sanctuary, the idea of like this space, it was constructed to be a space where people can come and together, create a worship experience where they can be in the presence of God and one another. And that can certainly happen, not just inside a sanctuary, but I think there is some power here in the physical presence piece.
Yeah, and something to be said for that within the context of resurrection and life as well. Because later on, Jesus says, where I go, there you will be with me also. So proximity seems to be important in some way.
Yeah.
But
Charles,
with
were you gonna?
communion, I know that I was going to say about communion is that, we were always told, never do private communion, always do it during worship.
Right.
Always, only the people who are there. And if they don't have a good excuse for not being there, don't take it to their house or any of that. Well, they go so far as to say that you should not be doing live stream communion, encouraging people at home to participate, because communion means community and we all have to be in the same room, which to that I say, nonsense.
Yeah.
And the reason is because God isn't magical. This isn't about getting the magic right. This is about God, God's grace, God's presence. And to think that I can manipulate God's presence by, serving communion and saying that, well, Jesus is only here, today, not somewhere else. It's just silly. It is to manipulate God, and I don't think you can do that. And it's like baptism, to suggest that you have to hold them under till they bubble doesn't quite get to the real meaning behind baptism and why we do it the way we do it.
Well, but this is what we do. Like there's and this is what the Pharisees were doing with the blind man last week, right? Of like, there must be a reason, a logical reason. There must be a formula. There is a way to get from point A to point B. There's a right answer for everything.
The guy Jesus heals is great. Why? You guys want to be disciples too?
Yeah. Yes.
And you know that he's being sarcastic here. There's no way he could be serious. He is, Well,
it's about time at that point, It's about time that he's just like, screw you. Okay, people. I've been repeating myself and none of you are actually listening. So
that's right.
Tim, one of the things I love that you said was that they're wanting to manipulate the presence of God. Like, and I think about, how many times I've done that, or like, why isn't God doing this or being like this for me? Just a few days ago, I was telling Sarah, I was like, I was having a walk through the woods, like cursing God because, just like shit wasn't going the way I thought it was going to go, or, there was just this off thing. And that just, that idea of how human and how many of us, right, try to manipulate the presence of God and gatekeep, like when you're talking about the communion, and just, it's like we're so often like worried about doing things the right way that we're like missing the point of it. Because I also think
that's right.
Not in this story, but when Jesus is like, are you tired? Are you worn out by like these religious, like, come to me and I will give you rest. And I think Jesus like holding that theme in his mind as he goes about and does all these things, like, and the simple power of Jesus is like, he was drawing people in by healing, by helping people see, by resurrecting the dead, which, that's like a great, like, that's the cash grab, like flashy bells. Yeah. The hook. And it's really, when you're like, okay, I'm expecting these kinds of miracles, I must have to make a sacrifice or do something like in order to get this. And Jesus just showing up. And I think that comment about presence too is so important, that I mean, it had to be a comfort for them to see Jesus, even though he's taking his sweet ass time getting
Right.
here, and he's like hanging out outside of the, like, what is he? It's like he's just like leaving these little breadcrumbs, you know.
Well, and you know,
Yes,
wouldn't
yeah.
it have saved everybody a lot of trouble if he'd just healed them across from wherever he
Right.
was?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That these people wouldn't feel bad. And listen, one of the reasons I have difficulty with the story, because I don't know that Jesus did Lazarus any favors. I mean, you think about it a minute, Lazarus gets to be dead again. He gets to die all over. I'm sure the first time you did it was a delightful experience. You had just got to know that the second time around will be even better. You know, and where was Lazarus for these 4 days if he wasn't right there? Now, all kinds of questions.
oh yeah,
But that's why you've got to try to stay within the boundaries of the passage of pericope, or else you end up making up stuff that cannot be true.
You go down many rabbit holes, which I normally do as I'm preparing for a sermon. I find
And
myself.
earlier I made a comment that I better clarify about the synoptic, about maybe the writer of John wanting it to show more of Jesus's deity.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, John also goes a long way in talking about Jesus's humanity too. That's important. In the first chapter, it was he came in the flesh.
Right.
It was
Word
not a
became
game.
flesh.
Came in the flesh. He was all God and all man. I don't know what that looks like or what that means, because you know, I think that Jesus was as comfortable in being a human being as he was in being God. You had used the word tension earlier. I think the tension is not so much between Jesus's humanity and deity as it is our notion that Jesus could be both.
Right. Yeah.
In the ancient world, they were happy to think of Jesus as being divine. They had a lot harder time thinking of being human.
Isn't that interesting? Because I feel like it's kind of the opposite now, at least in the dominant Christian culture.
Well,
But
that's because of science. We put our first, and I'm a big believer in science. You know?
Well, one of the things when you were talking about, you referenced John 1, the word became flesh, and thinking about Jesus' physical presence. And you had mentioned that Jesus can heal people from far away, but we also encounter a lot of stories in the gospel, about Jesus' physical presence. That is what makes the story significant. He's physically present with Nicodemus the Pharisee. He's physically present with the Samaritan woman at the well. And then he also touches people, and the woman who touches his cloak and is healed. And Jesus, I can't remember the context now, so it just sounds kind of creepy, but I know there's a couple times when it says he touched them, right?
Right. Well, he stops and says, someone has touched me, and there's a crowd all around him, and his disciples are going Jesus, you got 8 million people out here touching you. How can you say somebody's just touched?
Right. Did you want to comment on that, Charles?
No, I've thought about that story a lot. The woman who's, seeking healing, and she's like, if I can just touch the hem of his cloak or whatever, just this piece of him. I think about that. And then I also think the other story that frustrates me with Jesus regarding healing is when there's the Canaanite woman, I think she's referred to in one story.
Yes, the dog.
Yeah. And he's like, I didn't come to help you out. And she's like, yeah, but the bigger dogs get the scraps. And he's like, oh, okay. You said the correct thing. Whoosh, everything, this is your daughter's healed or whatever. And it's like, Jesus, what, were you just off of did you not get enough sleep that day? What, what the hell is wrong with you?
We really see his humanity there, right? When he calls the dog.
Yeah. And and kind of like going further into this story towards the end, when Jesus is seen, everybody's sobbing and weeping, and the message, it says like a deep anger welled up within him, which I was reading, whichever one is on the Vanderbilt thing, but
Yep.
it didn't say, I don't think it called it anger. I think it said he was greatly disturbed. So to me, like being disturbed and angry, like I don't really put the two together, right? Like being disturbed to me is not the same as being angry. But I think to me in this version, it just shows when I'm angry at something and I'm like really frustrated and I'm like, I don't know sometimes I just like, cry, right? Like you're like, I don't know how to get through this. And I love that Jesus is in my mind's picture, my mind's eye, it's like he's allowing himself to feel the actual emotions of everybody around him, even though he knows what's going to happen, right? Like he's going to raise Lazarus up, but leaning more into that humanity of like, I'm angry, now I'm weeping. And then of course, yeah, he raises up Lazarus, and then I'm like looking down, I'm like, wait, where did Lazarus go? Like, what's he doing? He's like, oh, I got a new lease on life. Like,
Yes.
let's
Yes.
party, Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I looked up that Greek real quick from 1133. He was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. And it says the Greek word here can be translated to agitate or trouble, to cause one inward commotion, take away their calmness of mind, disturb their equanimity, to disquiet, make restless, to stir up, to render anxious or distressed, to be perplexed. So that's like pretty wide range. I mean, this is one of those things that gets like lost in translation, truly. But I love that Jesus is like emotionally disturbed. Again, makes him so relatable.
The question that I have is, it's we get the statement in 38 right after, couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?
Yes.
Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone covered the entrance. Jesus said, remove the stone. Now, I like that, remove the stone, because it is, needless to say, it's foreshadowing Jesus's resurrection. All of this is, and this is, it transitions from this chapter into chapter 12, that this is the end of the signs, and then you get into the other part. But my point was just to simply say that I have been disturbed in as much that I have been angry and fearful and tearful and in pain all at the same time. I mean, there are times when I have grieved. How does Paul put it? I would not have you grieve like those who do not believe. And sometimes I do grieve like those who do not believe, which is to say, I get angry and teary-eyed, and I go away from it thinking, what a waste, yada, yada, yada. That is just simply not the way it is. That is not the worldview that Jesus tries to give us.
Yes.
And so there is, we can resonate with the way Jesus is feeling. Is he crying because his friend is dead? Is he crying because of the lack of faith of the mourners? Is he crying because he loves Martha and Mary and they're crying? There are any number of reasons why Jesus would be disturbed, but I think it's important to simply note that the one who can raise from the dead also has emotions and feelings.
Yes.
Like any human would.
Mhm. Mhm.
but one is not predicated on the other.
Mhm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that just reminded me as I was listening to you speak, Dad, of, I don't know, being in situations where I'm crying and somebody says, "What's wrong?" And there's nothing worse than when you can't name what's wrong,
That's right.
or everything is wrong. And you're like, where do I begin? And I think that's Jesus here, right? Like,
Well,
my
I'm more
disciples
like,
are morons. The Jews are trying to kill me. My friend is dead and nobody believes. Like, my friends are grieving, where do I begin?
on more than one occasion, as you might know, I've sat at coffee with your mother, and she has said the announcement, "I'm going to cry now."
Yes, I do that too now.
Yes, yes, I know.
Yes. Let me
Going
just
to-
announce it. So if you feel uncomfortable, you can leave the room.
Is there anything I can do to help? No. Okay,
Actually,
thought I'd check in.
so there's something else here too. Let me find it. It was right before that. Okay, so Jesus talks to Martha, um, then to Mary. Oh, verse 31. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up and go out. So there were some probably Jewish leaders, I'm gonna guess, because that seems to be who John is referring to when he says the Jews. But there were some people of faith
Right.
who were there, who were consoling Mary, who were also weeping and were distraught. I'm pretty sure it says that somewhere, though I can't find it.
You might want to also, if you're preaching this, diffuse somewhere in the sermons, diffuse the anti-Semiticism that people apply to
Yes.
this.
Yes.
This was
Absolutely.
after Christians had been put out of the synagogues, after the Jewish War, when no kind of variations that the Pharisees were putting
Mhm.
forward were allowed much anymore.
Mhm.
And so yeah,
Mhm.
it's just something to note that when it says the Jews,
Yeah.
well, it doesn't mean all of the Jews
Right.
everywhere.
Right.
In fact, most of the Jews that lived in Jesus's day didn't know who Jesus was, didn't even live in the Holy Land. And
Mhm.
so, you know, I know why the writer wants to blame all Jews everywhere all the time, but the guy who's writing it is Jewish himself, so I'm
Right.
not
Yes.
exactly sure
Yes.
how hard we want to condemn anybody.
Yes. Yes. So one of the things that I just noticed too is that, so in what we read to verse like 45,
Seven.
Mhm.
45, 47. Well, but then immediately following this, then there's this plot to kill Jesus. So
Right.
again, this event was like the last, the final straw that broke the camel's back. But then in verse 12, it starts out with Mary anointing Jesus. And so chronologically, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because it says in chapter 11 at the beginning, Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet. But then that happens in chapter 12, which I just feel like is a good note of like, this is not always chronological here, but
Well, in obvious, if it were chronology is not the important part
right. Yes.
here,
Yes.
because if it were, oh, well, in the Gospel of John, you have Jesus turning the tables at the beginning of his ministry, where in the synoptics, he's doing it at the end of his
end.
ministry.
Yeah.
Now, do I think that it makes that much difference? Yes, theologically it can. And I can see why John would put it up in front early, because this becomes the impetus for which the temple rulers want to kill Jesus.
Right. But I love this because you can make anything mean whatever you want it to mean, which we've discussed a lot on this podcast, right? So I mean, and I find theology in everything. Like, I found theology in the movie Cocaine Bear. So I feel like it's everywhere, right? Where
Yeah,
you
but
were going to
you're-
say something
yeah.
about that, Charles.
I was like, I found it in my floss container, and
Yes.
when And then
Where do you
I think
buy
I
your
told you about the
floss?
little, huh?
Is that a special they have at CVS or something? I that kind of where you see God in your floss.
If I had, I would have taken a picture of it and sold it on eBay. But no, I was trying to force this floss thing back together, and I wasn't looking at it fully. I didn't see the full way it should go, and I was like, how often do I'm trying to force something to happen and I don't see the whole picture, and like that's how I feel a lot of times in my spirituality, trying to force things to happen like it should be this way.
Yes, everything's
And
theological.
yeah, so I love that. And I was reading ahead to like what's going to happen in the story, and just um I don't know, I feel like Lazarus is so lucky that he gets named as opposed to like the other people we've been talking about recently, the Samaritan woman,
Oh, I
the
guess
man born blind. Lazarus could just be that guy who died and then was back again, but they name they name him. And yeah, there's so much here that I keep playing in my head. And I don't know about you both, but when I read this, or usually when I see like what it would look like in my mind of like these groups of people, and how Lazarus, like no one went in to get him. He's like, come out. And how much more of a showmanship again that is. It's not like Weekend at Bernie's where he's propping Lazarus up to be like, yeah, he's still alive. Like Lazarus walks out of his own
Weekend at Bernie's,
accord.
Yeah.
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 But yeah.
Well, so when I don't know this.
Real quick here, I wanted to mention something to Charles. Is that I remember hearing somebody say one time, and I just couldn't believe I heard it. But they made the comment that the reason Jesus used Lazarus's name to call him out, because if he had just simply said Lazarus, I did not say Lazarus, but just simply said, come out, all the dead people of all time everywhere would have been risen from the dead. Because Jesus said Lazarus, well, then that made it that way, we could pinpoint.
Okay.
Accuracy is important if you're going to be God.
So someone needs to make a zombie apocalypse movie. Maybe it should be Phil, where it starts with Jesus saying, come out, and Lazarus comes out of the tomb, but then all the dead people everywhere rise, and that's the zombie apocalypse.
Uh-huh.
I can't believe that hasn't been done.
Well, it probably has. And there's probably a reason why we've never heard of it.
It's a focus on the family special feature.
Yes.
That's beautiful. I love that. I love that.
Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. I want to talk about that's so bad. Okay, verse 41 and 42. So, again, John's author mentions like that it's been 4 days. Was it Mary who says, he's gonna stink. Oh no, Martha says,
Martha.
He's already stinky. I love that. He's already stinky. But again, visceral, talking about presence and like flesh and physical, like dead bodies rot. They stink. Like,
that's right.
Yeah.
I also want to note, I was going to say this before I forgot. Light and darkness are also themes throughout the Gospel of John, but they're found here too. If you wanted to do a series of sermons from the Gospel of John just on light and dark, boy, you would have 1,000 sermons. There are just so many things in here about light and darkness, and the challenges there are with light and darkness.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't do what's reasonable and what needs to be done because there's not enough light to see. And then there are times when you waited too late and it's dark out now and you can't do what you needed to get done.
Well, and in one of our previous episodes, we had mentioned, I think it was Nicodemus, because in Nicodemus we focused a lot on darkness because Jesus goes to talk to him by night.
At night, yes.
And one of the things that we discussed, and then I really kind of thought about it a lot that week, was like things gestating in the dark, you know, like a womb is dark, and things that grow in the dark, and like how if the sun was out, you know, in the desert all the time, it would be scorched, and how actually like the night is what provides, you know, this sustainable environment for the creatures that live there and things. So yeah, I think we have this tendency, and this is, I think, part of our dominant culture, but to associate like darkness as something negative or bad. And I really feel myself trying to move away from that and more towards like being curious about the darkness, like what happens in the darkness that doesn't happen in the light, and how is the balance of both of these things, how is that reflected in our own spiritual, you know, growth and walk and faith journey?
My hardest thing about the whole darkness light thing, and I'm not sure how to address it, it is that the worst part about the language of light and dark, or black and white, is that we put values on those things, and sometimes it ends up sounding racist as much as anything.
Yes. Well, and it is, I think that is rooted in I mean, the idea that like light is good and dark is bad, and how that has been equated with the color of somebody's skin, like everything else, rooted in white supremacy, patriarchy, all that shit. And I actually feel like it's not that difficult to name that and to just own it. I feel like to name that and own it, but then to be able to offer an alternative, like a way to speak about these incredible motifs. I mean, Jesus says, you know, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Like that is a pretty profound statement to make. I know we're approaching our hour here. So I don't want to cut us off, but I do want to ask you about verse 41 and 42. So Jesus says to Martha, "Did I not tell you if you believed you would see the glory of God? The stone is rolled away." And then Jesus addresses God. Yeah. "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of those standing here, so they may believe that you sent me."
Mm-hmm.
I'm hung on the part where he's like, "Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" And it's like, you know, in this moment, like, are they, what are they believing? Like, surely their beliefs are, you know, have been, did they fully know what they were believing? Like what the glory of God or what that entailed? Because surely, like, if they're like, well, our brother's dead now, but you could raise him, but it's almost like, it's almost like a freebie from Jesus. Like, you don't have to believe that hard right now. I'm going to show you this wonderful miracle. And then that's, you know, that's going to cause you to believe, which he calls out here. Like, I've spoken so that they might believe that you sent me.
Sees the opportunity to glorify God rather than the vexation of, you know, this man's death. It was, yeah.
Well, and that's interesting, Charles, that you brought attention to verse 40. "Did I not tell you if you believed you would see the glory of God?" Going back to what we were saying about, you know, those moments where we maybe grieve as though we don't believe, or those low moments, those moments of like, you know, where you're just like in the trench or in the dark or in the valley, and you're just wondering, like, when is this going to end? When is God going to show up? And I feel like one of the things that Phil does, my spouse, is that is so helpful is that when he's down or when I'm down, you know, his attitude is like, this too shall pass. We just have to hang on. You know, we have to keep going. He's an Enneagram 7, for those of you that know what that means, the enthusiast. So it's very, you know, character for him. And sometimes that's helpful for me to hear. Like sometimes I believe, sometimes I'm like, yes, this sucks, but it will get better. And sometimes I'm like, I'm not so sure. It's been really sucky for a really long time. And if it was going to get better, I think it would have gotten better by now. What if this is the rest of life, you know? And I think about when someone dies, like, were Mary and Martha really expecting Jesus to bring him back? Because they say, if you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened, you know? And
Well,
Jesus
that's what
with them in
Martha
their
says.
grief. What?
And that's what Martha says. Let's see. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out. While Mary remained in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died.
Mary says it too in verse 32. Lord, if you have been here, my brother would not have died. Like the same thing.
Oh, there you go. Good. I didn't notice that before.
They both do. So, I mean, and I kind of like that. I kind of like that they just said to Jesus, like, what the hell? Where were you? And that they just share that so openly and are like, yeah. Thoughts, Charles? Did you anything come up for you in that?
No, just that. No, I was like, what came up for me? I was just picturing them, you know, like, again, how it's how we can project blame onto things. Like if only this had been different,
Right.
everything would be okay. And Tim, when you were talking about Jesus, you know, healing people from a distance, I'm like, maybe that was, you know, Mary and Martha's like initial thing when they sent the person to go find Jesus and say like, hey, Lazarus is sick. They were maybe thinking he's going to snap his fingers from wherever he's wandering around and our brother's going to recuperate, I guess, because they hadn't seen, you know, Jesus bring anybody back from the dead yet. So they thought maybe that's a little bit out of your price range, or, you know, like above your management level is bringing people back from the dead.
Well, maybe Jesus like wanted them to be hopeless. Like maybe he wanted them to get to the point where like Lazarus is dead. So there was no hope for him to come back. I mean, that's kind of grim, but maybe.
I think Jesus is more befuddled by their doubt than anything else. He thinks that if there's anybody who should be able to believe in God and God's promises, it's you. I mean, you're God's people, right? And they continuously do things that demonstrate a lack of faith. But also it is, you know, you have Jesus pressing them about what they believe, about Martha, you know, that there will be this general resurrection. And by the way, Jesus and his followers, as well as his friends here, they're obviously all Pharisee. They all believe in the resurrection of the dead. And the Sadducees didn't believe that. And the Essenes, who knows? And the Zealots, who knows?
These are all sects of Judaism, by the way, for our listeners.
Sort of lack of a denomination, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yes, Sadducees.
So Jews hate it when you use the word denomination in reference to their different groups.
No, they were sects. SECTS, not to be confused with sex.
Which is horizontal. I get it. Never mind. And so that's enough. I don't know.
I was gonna say, did I derail you there with my
a little bit?
Okay, so I want to end on something, and this is so good because, Dad, I feel like you bring a lot of historical knowledge and historical contextual knowledge to
You
this.
say I'm old, right? Is what you're saying? Is
No,
Wise.
I didn't. Yeah, wise, but also just like smart. You remember shit that you learned a long time ago when you were in seminary.
Yeah, but I can't remember what I read an hour ago.
So maybe old, maybe that is what I was saying. But I feel like as a budding biblical scholar, I appreciate that, and it certainly helps me understand the text. And because like we're all Bible nerds, we get into that. Like we're like, oh yeah, this is so interesting. But then I take a step back and I think about, especially in our faith community right now, we have a lot of folks who are new to the church. We have folks that carry religious trauma from their upbringing, that have had the courage to step back in because of their desire to be part of Christian community and to follow the way of Jesus. And this story, it seems kind of like, what's the word I want to use? Like out there, like how do we take this story seriously without just being like, oh, it's all a metaphor? Because I also feel like that's not enough either, right? Like, and there's all this we've talked about the physicality about Jesus' physical presence, and like Lazarus' physical body, stinks. Like there's something about the physical presence. And I guess what I'm getting at is like, what is the takeaway? I mean, how does this story transform and move without just being like woo woo, or, it's all part of the narrative structure set up for John for the resurrection. But especially for people like we who haven't witnessed or seen resurrection in our lives physically, what does it mean? Who cares about this story?
So to me, I'm going to jump in here, going back to, we didn't touch on this, but when Jesus replies to his disciples about like the Jews are going to kill you if you go back there, and Jesus has almost this like riddle about walking in sunlight, and at night people can stumble, and then he says our brother Lazarus has fallen asleep. And to me, that takeaway is Lazarus forgetting who he was, like that he is the Christ also within him, and Jesus reminding everybody that in this very bombastic way of showmanship, that we don't really die, like, and he's saying like, if you believe like me, that we all have the Christ within us, that we're made of God, we're made of love never dies, which I think is the sequel to Phantom of the Opera. Don't watch that musical, but but I think to me, like, that's the hopeful thing, is that Lazarus is waking up back into his identity as beloved of God. And in this beautiful story, it's him coming out of the tomb and being loved by Jesus, and that physicality of like Lazarus is still around, and Jesus is using Lazarus and Lazarus's body as this communication of, because of what we all are underneath this physical exterior, we're all made of God, and that's not going away. And that's kind of like reading it, I guess, more not as metaphor, because I'd be like, yes, I can see this in my mind, I believe this is what's going on. Do I really believe it? Sometimes I do, and then on crappy days, no, like, but to me, the hope is like Jesus is waking Lazarus back up into his identity as a child of God, and not,
and not just another breathing existence.
Yeah, and that's how what I'm walking away from this with is, and that's a personal thing. And I think it's interesting how other people, what they take away from this, if this is again the good news, what is the good news from this? And I also think Jesus showing compassion and being there for the people, and feeling this anger and this grief, and then that crying, that release, right? Because sometimes that crying is a release of like everything that you're frustrated about. And
Mm.
Also, I just wanted to say verses 8 and 9, where the disciples replied, Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you, but you want to go back to Jerusalem where they want to kill him. Anyway, and that's when Jesus says, aren't there 12 hours? And in those who walk in the day don't stumble, but those who walk at night do. It sounds like Jesus is saying that, people who don't know what they're doing are stumbling around this. And now is the time of the light. And so I know what's going on in a way that these folks don't. And so he does. He even to the point where he knows Lazarus is dead.
Well, and it says because the light is not in them. So that's an interesting language of like the light is not in them, or they have not come to know the light in them. They have not accepted or experienced the light in them. What does the Message say there, Charles? I'm interested in that because it always has interesting.
I actually like what you just said better, because in the Message it says walking at night. Anyone who walks in daylight doesn't stumble because there's plenty of light from the sun. Walking at night, he might very well stumble because he can't see where he's going. And I love that illustration of the light in them that you were just, because the light is not in them. And I think that to me is more powerful than what the Message says, which sorry, Eugene, not this time,
Well, last week the Message was the winner of all the translations. So you can't be a winner every week.
I know.
I love what you said, Charles, about like Jesus utilizing Lazarus' body as a way to communicate like the promise. But like that, I'm going to spend time thinking a lot about like the physical here, the physical presence, Jesus showing up, the physical body, like Lazarus' physical body. I mean, I feel like there's something there I haven't quite tapped into, but that feels
and there is a tension, I think, between raising him from the dead and the spiritual aspects of what's being discussed. So I don't know where to go with that yet.
Oh, good.
I love that. Great. I love that. Yeah, I'm so glad to hear other people say that, because it's like I always want to wrap everything in a bow and be like, it's perfect and it's done and we figured it out. And I think that's something I've been learning doing these and talking. It's like because you don't have to.
I don't have any idea sometimes what I'm talking about. Might have come out clearly in my message this morning, but it is by the time I sit down and work out my actual sermon, I will have had another 1,000 thoughts about this.
Yeah, same.
And because there's always so much more than what you can see.
Yeah. Well, and I also feel like I actually think a really like faithful response as a preacher is to read the text and to have that reaction of like, I'm not sure where to go with this, or there's a lot here, or in the last couple of weeks especially, there's so many different directions you could go. I mean, you could preach 100 sermons on these texts, and as I was telling someone this week, like, you just have to pick a lane, because the worst thing you could do is be like, I want to preach 4 sermons in one, and so you just are like pinballing around, as opposed to like, this is what this sermon is about this week. When we revisit this text in the lectionary.
Well, that's what happened to me this morning. Is I got overwhelmed. And plus, I was thinking about doing this. So my parishioners had a bad day today because of you.
Oh, it was my fault. I invited you to the podcast.
How come it got dark there all of a sudden for Charles? Oh, there we go.
Oh, because the sun's setting.
Yeah, and it's like what, 70 degrees there or something. So
it is only 44 today. It is ice cold. I don't know if that's
wow.
Yeah.
It's like warmer here, I think. That's crazy.
Yeah, I was confused, Charles. I had forgotten that you live in North Carolina now, right?
Yes, yep, I do. Yeah, and it's sunsetty, so the sun's coming in, and the when I started out, my light was okay.
Yeah,
Um,
the time of day.
yeah, it's almost the golden hour, so I gotta.
Well,
Wow,
you're
that's
even up. You're even.
Well, I love that we were able to do this across time zones. We have like Eastern, Central, and Pacific all represented here today. So thank you, Dad, for joining us and being a part of
My
our
pleasure.
conversation. And those of you listening, like the video, comment, our email is listed below. Send us your feedback. Let us know what you think. Subscribe. If you listen to this and you have brilliant ideas or insights, definitely email me. So I have that for the sermon. You want to add something, Charles?
yeah. I was just gonna say, what do you get out of the story?
Yes.
Like what when you read this, what triggers or sparks for you? And if you don't know, that's fine. But if something's like, man, this really fed my soul today by reading this, share it so we can enjoy,
Grow.
yeah, and learn. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.